And we're now moving to our last speaker on this panel and today's conference. Professor David Head is the Chaim Perlman Chair in Philosophy at Hebrew University. His main topics of interest are ethical theory, political philosophy, and bioethics. In the latter field, Professor Head wrote the first introductory book on medical ethics in Hebrew, a book, Gene Ethics, which deals with the issue of the moral standing of future people, which is particularly relevant to genetic technologies, and numerous articles on such topics as experimentation on human subjects, wrongful life claims, prenatal diagnosis, Plato's concept of health, and sex selection. Professor Head has published extensively on other spheres of ethics and society, primarily on the idea of toleration and issues of social and intergenerational justice. Beyond his academic work in bioethics, David Head has taken an active part in the public debates about the formation of laws and regulations on a wide array of bioethical issues in Israel. He served as a member of governmental committees on surrogacy, euthanasia, organ donation, and genetic technologies, and was a member of the National Council for Bioethics, Hadassah's Helsinki Committee, the Ethics Committee of the Israeli Association of Fertility, and head of the Ethics and Research Committee at Hebrew University. As of yesterday, he is also the recipient of the Edmond Prize. His lecture is titled Eugenics, a Jewish Perspective.
Thank you, Shai. Thank you, everybody. Thank you as organizers too. It's a pleasure. Time is running out and everybody's already tired. I'll make a short presentation. You'll be grateful that I'm going to cut even another 10% of it, so I won't tax your patience too much. We had enough facts today, so I'm going to turn to counterfactuals, because that's what we philosophers usually do. We are not interested really in reality, but how it could be. And I was struck to learn about a year ago that the Jewish tradition has also addressed the topic I'm going to discussing, genetic enhancement or eugenics, in the counterfactual way. So I'll start. Jonathan Crane, to whom I'm indebted, is a scholar of Jewish thought and bioethics in Emory University in the United States. He has turned my attention, will immediately start reading the quotation, to some halachic sources, or rather midrashic sources, from the first centuries AD, which are in a striking way referring to the issue we are facing now of the possibility of human enhancement. These sources, they refer to fantasies about the radical improvement of human capacities almost 2 millennia before such improvement has become even remotely possible. It is not very common in the practically oriented Talmudic thought to find purely speculative thought experiments about human beings being physically improved. Counterfactuals have little practical implication, yet they definitely have a powerful theoretical role in the discussion of theological issues such as the power of God, the limitations of human understanding, and the logical limits of fantasies about human beings being other than they actually are. Take the first short passage from the Midrash, a 3rd century Jewish homiletic commentary on the Torah, here on Deuteronomy. The context of discussion is God's perfection. So now we have God's work complete all those in the world. None can ridicule one of God's deeds, even the cause of anything, nor can one wonder of them. Only if I had 3 eyes. Oh, if only I had 3 hands. Oh, if only I had 3 legs. Or if I could walk upon my head. Or oh, if I could turn my face behind me. How beneficial it would be for me. How can we reconcile our belief in divine perfection with our unavoidable fantasies about possible improvements of the human body or functioning? Why can't human beings be enhanced? The answer of the sages in the text is far from clear. What does it mean one cannot wonder about such imaginary improvements? So another midrashic, close midrash, gives us some further clue. It says, this can be compared to a king of flesh and blood who built a palace. The palace creatures, specifically people, entered inside it and said, if the columns were taller, it would be even more beautiful. If the walls were higher, it would be even more beautiful. If the ceiling were higher, it would be even more beautiful. But should a person come and say, oh, that I had 3 eyes, oh, that I had 3 legs, it would be beneficial to me, this would be strange. Itmaha in Hebrew, Aramaic, and remain this strange, to which I'll come back in the end of the presentation. It goes on, consider that which he had already made him, asehu in Hebrew. It's not written here, but instead that which they had already made him, asuhu. If it were possible to say the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be him, God, and God's court voted upon each and every limb of yours and stood up in your proper form, it is thus written, is this the way to repay Adonai, you foolish and unwise people? Is he not your father, your creator, who made you and formed you? Here we can trace 3 reasons against the fantasy of human enhancement. First, it would be a sign of ingratitude. Is that the way to repay God who created us? Secondly, it would be foolish, human constitution being the product of such meticulous process in the divine court. And thirdly, it would be strange because of the difference between considering an architectural improvement of a palace and an improvement of our human identity. According to the 3 reasons implicit in this quotation, I wish to suggest a 3-step analysis of these highly fictional reflections, which for their time may be seen quite wild. And here I'm not claiming any specialist familiarity with the history of interpretation or its methodologies, but I become a philosopher of my own, in my own way. One way, the first one, one may wonder about God's moral ways, despite God's righteousness. 2, one may wonder about the natural world, despite its divine complexity and unfathomable design, and even manipulate this world for human needs. 3, however, one may not, or rather it is absurd to wonder about human beings having different nature, let alone try to actually transform it. The discussion of these 3 levels of wonder about God's ways serves Jewish thought to reflect on 3 fundamental questions. First, can the moral order be other than it is? Second, can nature operate in a different way than it does? And 3, and most important for our concern here, can human beings be of a different nature? Take the first moral counterfactual. It is important to know that the context of the debate in Sifrei Dvarim, the one we saw just now, source is typically moral. The entire paragraph following the quotation about the thought experiments of having 3 eyes and 3 feet declares this idea to be absurd, because he is just in all his ways. He sits in court with every single one and allocates to him or her what they deserve. The whole section is a standard theodicy, an appeal to God's righteousness. I want to emphasize that theodicy is a legitimate project. It is neither immoral nor absurd to wonder, to raise questions, or to try to understand what at least seems to be a morally defective world. Abraham, the founding father of the Jewish people, is engaged in a bold and determined moral debate with God's decision to kill the people of Sodom, and even wins that debate. And although there were many questions as to the ways of God in the times of the Holocaust, they were never treated as either silly or heretical. Moral counterfactuals often make sense. They are even encouraged as part of human project of making the world a better place. This is often referred to as the ideal of tikkun olam, literally repairing the world, which is usually understood as the perfection of the world by the improvement of human behavior, but sometimes, particularly in Kabbalistic thought, as the metaphysical power of human practice to perfect creation itself. Thought experiments in theology are no less useful than their counterparts in science. In both cases, they serve to ultimately uncover the possible explanation for why the world or the ways of God are what they are, even if they seem to be defective or deviating from the idealized law-like behavior. In bioethical thinking about intervention in the human genome, it is, for instance, a way to test the distinction between human enhancement and the creation of a completely new transhuman species. To put it in Leibnizian language, the fact that the world is the best possible world does not mean that every particular part constituting it does not look in itself and independently of its place in the whole as lacking. Reflecting on possible improvements of particular properties of or individuals in the world might show us that how these would destroy the value of other properties or individuals. Contemporary genetic and environmental sciences are very much aware of this possible risk involved in genetic engineering or modification. Removing one harmful gene or a biological species which seem to harm us, for example in agricultural production, may unexpectedly cause a more serious long-term harm. Moving to the second level of discourse about possible enhancement of human beings, the focus now is not on God's moral ways but on God's natural ways. The first sentence of the paragraph quoted above says, the rock, Hatzur, perfect is his work. Hatzur, Hatzayar, the artist, he formed the world and formed the man in it, namely, and the Lord God formed the man. Perfect is his work. His work is whole with all creatures, and his ways are not to be brought into question. The slightest variation is not to be entertained regarding them. If I had 3 ears, if I had 3 hands, if I had 3 feet, if I could walk on my head, how wonderful would it be? This is the intent of perfect is his work. The text points to a non-moral explanation of the absurdity of the counterfactual of humans having 3 feet, hands, or eyes. It does not deal with the just and righteous way with which God deals with human beings after their creation, but with the natural perfection in which they are created ab initio. Their being what they are is not a matter of desert, but of divine perfection. There's a conceptual difference between the constraints on God's moral treatment of already existing human beings, the test of desert, and the constraints on the way God designs human beings in the act of creation itself. Accordingly, Sifrei Dvarim text appeals in the context of the creation of the human body to the metaphor of the artist who designs or shapes the natural world and human species in a perfect way. Creation is not a matter of justice, but of formal or aesthetic perfection. The world is compared to a work of art, which, if perfect, does not tolerate even the slightest change in any of its elements. The synonym of the term God, which is used here, tsur, which is correctly translated as rock in the English version, but the Midrashic interpreters make appeal to 3 pertinent linguistic connotations of this Hebrew word for rock, tsur, giving form or shaping, tsar, painting, tzier, and creating, yatzar or yitzer. These are merely phonetic connotations rather than associations to a common grammatical root. but they do create a powerful alliteration which creates meaningful semantic connections which Hebrew speakers here in the audience will easily appreciate. הצור תמים פועלו, הצייר שהוא צר, העולם תחילה וצר בו את האדם, שנאמר וייצר אדוני את האדם. The justification of God in creating humans with two rather than three eyes is not that this is what is just or what they deserve, but that it is the only way human beings can serve their role in the overall design of the world. Any change in their identity would undermine the integrity of the world or nature as a whole. This, however, does not mean that there is no intellectual, even practical point in questioning the form and function of human beings as they are, or indeed of any part of nature. Although we cannot understand the overall structure of the order of the natural world, this does not hinder us from using or manipulating the natural world for our own good. Epistemical limitation does not block the possibility of researching nature and gaining theoretical and practical insights into God's creation by deploying the human intelligence and ingenuity. Furthermore, there is nothing heretical about the human presumption to understand and control nature, which is, for example, necessary for medical sciences, but equally for agriculture and engineering. Thus, says Rabbi Nachman, the complexity of the natural world, may be compared to a thicket of reeds, svach, which no man could enter, for whoever entered therein lost his way. What did a certain clever man do? He cut down some reeds, entered through the clearing, and went on. And went out. Then all began to enter through this clearing and managed to get out. In parentheses, I should note that a second striking illustration immediately follows that text, an exact parallel of the myth of Theseus, making use of Ariadne's thread in penetrating the Minotaur's labyrinth and coming out unscathed and without getting lost. Thus, in the same ways, it is not forbidden to question the moral ways of God, since human beings were created with the capacity to distinguish between good and evil and with free choice. It is not forbidden to use human intelligence, also conferred on human beings by God, to mold the natural surroundings, even though its essential structure cannot be fully grasped. Again, counterfactual thinking is extremely useful as a scientific method, as for example in imagining movement without friction or a world in which the axis of our planet is not tilted. But if that is the case, why shouldn't human beings try their luck entering the genetic thicket of reeds? That is to say, should research into the possible transformation of human beings themselves lie beyond the pale? Why not entertain the idea of a world with posthumans who can never sin or err, and maybe also to work towards manipulating the genome so as to enhance human beings to become such creatures? This brings us finally to the third stage, which is the crux of my argument. Can we imagine ourselves, in contrast to non-human nature, as different from what we actually are? And even if we can we aspire to become such beings? And if such fantasy, having 3 legs or 3 hands, becomes a realistic option to which we are getting closer, would that be ethically permitted? Here I believe the classical Jewish texts teach us that we reach the limits imposed both by faith and logical sense. There's something both heretical and ridiculous, or in English translation which we used, strange, as you remember, in that scenario. Heretical or rebellious, because human beings were created not merely as part of nature, but also as non-natural beings who have special position, indeed a telos in the creation scheme, that of direct manifestation of divinity. Ridiculous or absurd, because one cannot really desire to be something completely different from what one actually is, namely losing one's own essential identity. Take the heretical first. A radical transformation of human nature, such as envisaged by genetic enhancement or in midrashic language by adding a third eye to our heads, would go against the unique role of human beings are assigned in the world. The spreading of God's image, that is the telos, of all natural creatures, animate or inanimate. Human beings are only partly natural. They are endowed with the power of tsar, tsayar, yatsar, giving form, designing, and creating. By either relinquishing these powers, for example, by becoming robotic entities or post-human creatures, or by extending it to a degree of the usurpation of God's power, what we refer to as playing God, we are undermining the divine plan of creation and the ultimate source of value of the very act of creation. The idea of the image of God is textually and contextually associated with the commandment of procreation, which captures the unique status of humans in the world. It involves a far-reaching measure of freedom to human beings, both as choice makers of good and evil and as users of the natural world. But this being their place in the world, there's at least one limit on the exercise of their extensive liberty, and that is their own nature. Human nature becomes sacrosanct in the sense of the do not touch principle. Human nature being divine in this particularly direct sense cannot be an object of manipulation. We may engineer every part of nature except for our own genome or our species identity. But not myself being part of Jewish theological discourse, I'm more attracted to the other reason, to the word strange, etmaha, used to characterize the three-legged or three-eyed fantasies. This finally brings us to the argument from the logical absurdity, which the Midrash proposes against the validity of the thought experiment. I believe that the text is highlighting this logical strangeness rather than heresy by contrasting the contemplation of the visitor to the magnificent royal palace. If only the columns were taller and the ceiling higher, the building would look more beautiful. Contrast it with the fantasy of having an extra eye or leg to our body. The first makes sense. A building can always be improved and look to us more beautiful. But the second is problematic, logically speaking. If we take a three-eyed version of myself as a metaphor for a radical change in the way I'm constituted, the Midrash is philosophically right in claiming that such a change would not be beneficial to me. It won't be me anymore. Or to put it in the language of the story of the reeds we just quoted, we are getting close to being able to cut into the labyrinth of our genetic structure, but although we might manage to do so safely, it won't be us anymore who will come out of it. This, of course, leaves open the specific question about the essence of human nature or the source of human identity as individuals and as a species, and hence the actual limits of the manipulation of our genes and their legitimate or illegitimate enhancement. A third eye, like an enhanced musical skill, does not necessarily undermine the position of humans as reflecting God's image on the one hand, or undermining our identity on the other. But the theoretical lesson we can draw from these striking thought experiments by the sages is that there are limits on the very idea of human enhancement, both metaphysical and logical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.